Do you ever find yourself trying to sleep but can't seem to stop thinking about problems you need to solve or things you need to do? At least a third of people have trouble sleeping. The most common complaint as to why people can't sleep is that they can't turn their minds off. Does this sound like you? So far, we've covered the psychological, physiological, and neurological consequences of poor sleep. Today, we're going to focus on the third major cause of difficulty sleeping, cognitive overactivation. I'm Dr. Chris Friesen from Friesen Performance, where I help you achieve your greatest potential by optimizing your psychology, physiology, and neurology. Have you experienced any of these? Being unable to quiet your mind in order to sleep? Or lying down in bed and having a hard time tuning out your mental chatter? Or being unable to let go of your thoughts? You may be worrying about tomorrow or the future, ruminating about today or the past, or even worrying or getting upset over the fact that you're not asleep yet. Have you been there? I know I have. Most people describe cognitive overactivation as being unable to turn their minds off in order to sleep. So far, we've covered things like yoga, mindfulness, and strengthening a function of our minds known as the observing self, or metacognition. We've also covered things like scheduling worry time, having a daily check-in, writing things down or having a place to write things down while we're lying in bed, and also reading in bed. We're now going to focus more on neurological strategies to help deal with cognitive overactivation. To do this, we need to do a quick primer on brainwaves. Our brains are electrochemical organs. There's enough electricity in our brains to power a small light bulb. The electrical activity of our brains are measured in terms of speeds of large groups of neurons pulsing. This is measured in terms of hertz, or cycles per second. But I need to point out that it's not quite as simple as speeds. The different brainwaves or the different speed of brainwaves come from different layers of the brain. Delta waves are between 1 and 4 hertz. Theta waves are between 4 and 8 hertz. Alpha waves between 8 and 12 hertz. Beta or beta 1 waves are usually between 14 or 15 and 20 hertz. Beta 2 waves are usually between 20 and 30 hertz. And then there's gamma waves, which are usually between 35 and 45 hertz, but they can go up to 100 hertz. Gamma waves are somewhat controversial because they're difficult to measure with an EEG or electroencephalogram, because they overlap with muscle tension. So we're primarily going to focus on delta, theta, alpha, and beta waves. The slowest waves are delta waves, and they come from the deepest layers of the brain. Beta waves come from the outer layers, or the cortex. Cortex is Latin for bark. Think of a tree's bark. It's a thin outer layer of the tree. It's important to understand that our brain produces all brain waves all the time. The difference is in the proportion, and these are correlated with particular brain states or levels of arousal. So for example, delta waves, they tend to predominate when we're in deep sleep. This is when the brain cleans itself, and it occurs in the earlier parts of the night. The mental states correlated with high levels of theta waves is usually when you're drowsy, daydreaming, and unfocused. When your brain's in a predominantly alpha state, your brain tends to be idling, and alpha waves are when the brain is idling or relaxing or resting. This is correlated with being in more of a mindful state, being in the present moment, but at this point we're not drowsy. Think of mindfulness meditation. When people meditate, we tend to produce more alpha waves when we're in the present moment and we're relaxed. Beta waves, or beta 1, is when we tend to be processing information. This occurs in the cortex or the outer layer. So we get a lot of beta when we're studying, thinking, or talking. When our brains are predominantly in a high beta state, this is when our brains are in an inefficient processing state. This is associated with panic, anxiety, overthinking, and just overprocessing in general. When our brains produce a lot of high beta, it is usually very difficult to sleep, and we often feel keyed up and on edge. As we lie down to go to sleep, ideally our brains shift from these stages. So we start off in a beta state. We may be thinking when we lie down in bed at first, but then we slip more into an alpha state. We get more into the present moment. our minds may go blank. Eventually, we drift off into a theta state. In this state, we tend to feel drowsy and we may be asleep at this point. Finally, we end up in a delta state, and this is when we're definitely asleep. So what does this all mean? Well, when we're cognitively overactivated, our brains are stuck more in a beta state, when we need it to go more into an alpha state or a theta state in order to fall asleep. So in previous videos, I went over a number of psychological strategies to help deal with cognitive overactivation, but we're now focusing more on neurological strategies. One of the cheapest and simplest ways to possibly change our brain states is to listen to tones via earphones. This is known as binaural beats. The way binaural beats work is that you hear two tones of varying frequencies in each of your ears through headphones. This produces an auditory illusion of a third tone. So for example, in one ear you may hear a 450 Hz signal or tone, while the other ear is 460, and the difference between these two is 10 Hz, and therefore you'll hear a 10 Hz tone. Binaural beats are thought to entrain the brain. Entrainment means the brain will mimic an external stimulus. So for example, if your binaural beats are set to 10 Hz, your brain is assumed to mimic those 10 Hz and therefore put your brain into a 10 Hz or alpha state. Interestingly, the research on binaural beats in terms of whether it entrains your brain is mixed. Some studies do show an entrainment effect, and some studies don't. Despite this, there is modest to strong evidence that binaural beats can improve things like anxiety, sleep, pain, mood, and cognition. For example, there's research showing that binaural beats set to beta or gamma have been shown to increase both working memory and attention. There's also evidence that binaural beats set to alpha or theta can reduce stress and anxiety. So theoretically, listening to binaural beats set at theta or alpha may be able to reduce cognitive overactivation. This is because, especially when alpha waves are high, our brains tend to stop thinking. I've personally experimented with binaural beats myself. I found that when I set it to beta, I do find I'm able to focus a bit better, but at times it can be distracting. The sound can be distracting. I think it will depend a lot on whether you're the type of person that tends to focus better with background noise or when it's silent. I've also found a mild effect when I set binaural beats to theta or alpha in terms of relaxing my mind and helping me sleep. I find that I think less when the headphones are on and for a while afterwards. The app that I use is called Brainwave. I'll put a link in the description below. I believe this app is only for Apple products, but there are also ones for Android, and I'll put a link to those below, but I'll say that I have not personally used them. So if you have trouble sleeping because you have a hard time shutting your mind off, it may be worth trying binaural beats. It's pretty simple and cheap. I will note that it's definitely not as strong as other options. For example, audio-visual entrainment, or AVE, which I'm going to talk about in the next video, definitely has a stronger effect. Similarly, binaural beats is likely less effective than alpha neurofeedback, where you train your brain to naturally produce more alpha waves. So stay tuned for other neurological strategies to help you deal with a chattering mind in order to sleep. If you like this content, don't forget to subscribe and click the like button. It lets me know that you find these videos useful and encourages me to produce more in the future. So until next time, keep moving forward.